Good afternoon. I'm Haley Soifer, CEO of the Jewish Democratic Council of America. And I want to thank the over 500 of you who registered for our second policy event of 2023, a briefing on Ukraine as the war enters its second year. In February 2022, we all witnessed Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine and ongoing attacks, making it the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Jewish Dems have been deeply concerned about the growing humanitarian toll of this war, including the millions of displaced persons and refugees. Meanwhile, Russian President Putin has clearly committed war crimes, and we are glad to see the International Criminal Court taking steps just this week to hold him accountable. At JDCA, we are committed to defending democracy in the United States and around the world, including in Ukraine. We unequivocally condemn Russia's ongoing invasion and attacks against Ukraine and are grateful for actions taken by President Biden to support the Ukrainian military and people, which we'll discuss today with two of the leading experts on the crisis in Ukraine and U.S. foreign policy, USAID Administrator Samantha Power and former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul. The first half of our program will be moderated by JDCA board member and policy committee chair, Tom Kahn. For more than 3 decades, Tom worked in Congress, including as staff director for the House Budget Committee. In addition to serving on the JDCA board, Tom is also a distinguished faculty fellow at American University, where he teaches students about the federal budget, Congress, and the presidency. Tom, thanks for being here today, and over to you to lead the discussion with Ambassador McFaul.
Thank you so much, Haley, and welcome everybody. We're really thrilled to have such a terrific turnout today. Really looking forward to an exciting discussion and a fascinating one with our first guest today. Ambassador McFaul is one of the leading experts on Russia in, I would say, the world. For 5 years, the ambassador served in the Obama administration, first as special assistant to the president and senior director at the National Security Council for Russian and Eurasian Affairs. Then he was our ambassador in Moscow. He has authored numerous books, including some on the bestseller, an outstanding one I just finished reading called From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. He's an international analyst for NBC, a columnist for the Washington Post. It's just an extraordinary resume of distinction. Today, the ambassador is one of the most respected voices outside of government regarding the war in Ukraine. So we are absolutely thrilled to welcome you today, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule. If I may just ask you a few questions. First of all, just about a year ago, the global community watched in horror as Russia launched its offensive in Ukraine. Many thought that the war would be over very quickly, and yet nevertheless, the Ukrainians were able to fight valiantly and push the Russians back. Why were our expectations so wrong? And what, in your view, was the decisive turning point?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Tom. Second, why are we starting with such a hard question? But it's a very important question. And I think we eventually need to have a real study of your question and figure out what we got right and what we got wrong. Remember, we got right the intelligence about Putin's intention to invade. That was an incredible achievement of our intelligence community. They then took, I think, a very strategic and bold step to declassify that information. If you will recall, that's what they did, and that helped to mobilize the world, especially democratic countries around the world, to get ready for a response. And I was impressed by that. Both, I used to deal with intelligence in the government. I don't have security clearances anymore, but I know how hard a target Vladimir Putin is for our intelligence community, and that they had it so definitively was a spectacular achievement. That they then made the policy decision to declassify it, I thought was really smart. And then they got horrifically wrong what you just pointed out. We thought this war was going to be over in a matter of days, weeks. We packed up our embassy. We blew up all the surveillance and security equipment that we have. That's not the right words, communications equipment that we have at the embassy, because we didn't think we were going to go back. And I do think we have to have a better answer for why. As I think about it, a couple of things come to mind. One, we overestimated Russian military power. And I'm writing a book right now about great power competition between China, Russia, and the United States. And when I do my power chapters, I have to count up, the number of tanks, the number of soldiers, GDP per capita that's spent on the military in each of those countries. Those are things we can count up. We can't count up will to fight by the Russians, right? And we sometimes obscure, especially in the Russia case, although I think maybe in China's case as well, we forget that there's a lot of corruption in that system. And so just counting up the numbers that they're spending on their military, they might not be spending on their military. Some of that might be siphoned off. In fact, I think we know now that it was siphoned off in corruption. So they didn't have the capacity that we assumed. And second, I think we underestimated Ukrainians' warriors, soldiers' will to fight, right? That's another very hard thing to measure, right? How do you measure will to fight? You can count up tanks, you can count up soldiers, but it's hard to measure will to fight. And they demonstrated that back when they had hardly any support from us militarily. Let's remember, they defended Kiev with minor assistance from us. And let me tell you, the one person that got that right, and I should be careful here, maybe you might not want his name in the record publicly, but for many decades, the California National Guard had a training program with Ukraine. It was set up after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was called Partnership for Peace, and every former republic of the Soviet Union set up a training program with one of our states. We here in California got Ukraine. I think Alabama has Uzbekistan, and I used to remember all the rest of the list. I've forgotten, but this was going on for decades. And what they would have told you was that the Ukrainians have been fighting this war against Russia not since 2022, but since 2014. Therefore, they had a lot of military experience, and they were ready for the fight in 2022, and I think in ways that we did not expect. And then the third factor that came in later, not in the beginning, was Western military assistance. That Putin didn't predict, right? He did not think we would do this time what we didn't do in the previous wars that he had fought in the region. And that, I think, eventually made a big difference in how this war was fought, at least in 2022.
Great. Thank you for that great answer. Second, I'm curious if you could talk about other steps that we could be taking, the United States could be taking to support Ukraine, particularly with the predicted Russian offensive that's going to be coming in the spring. And whether you think there's any line that could be drawn. I mean, there's people talk about, taking certain steps that will then trigger responses by Russia, including even a tactical nuclear weapon. But what more can we do in the West and the United States in particular?
Well, Tom, let me first start with the good news and then answer your question, because I think it's important to think about both of these things at the same time. 2022, in the way that I read what happened on the ground, on the battlefield, and in terms of military and economic and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, all three of those things, I think was a fantastic success. First and foremost for the Ukrainian military, but for their government and for the way that they have managed their economy under duress. Remember what Putin told us were his objectives at the beginning of the war. And you don't need to believe me. He said them very bluntly. He said, one, I want to unite the Slavic nation that was divided by the West and by the Bolsheviks, by the way. He indicted both of them as dividing Ukrainians and Russians because they're one nation, according to Putin. Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. Two, he promised what he called denazification. By that, he meant regime change, and he meant to overthrow the democratically elected president of Ukraine, of Jewish heritage, by the way. That was what he called denazification. Third, demilitarization. He wanted to get rid of all the weapons in Ukraine so it wouldn't be a alleged threat. Fourth, he wanted I think he wanted to take all of Ukraine and annex all of Ukraine, at least the eastern parts. And then fifth, to stop NATO from expanding. He failed on all 5 of those counts. Let's just be clear, right? Battle of Kiev, he lost. Battle of Kharkiv, he lost. Took Kherson, and now he's lost it. 50% of the territory that he conquered, he's lost. That's a fantastic achievement in 2022. Second, the government of President Zelensky is in power. He didn't leave. As he said famously, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And he stayed in Kiev. Tremendously brave decision that he made. He's still in power. Third, demilitarization, exact opposite. It is more Ukraine is more militarized today than any time in its history. I forgot the first one, uniting Slavic Ukrainians and Slavic Russians. Putin has achieved exactly the opposite. 90% of Ukrainians have rallied behind their president and see their identity as Ukrainian stronger today than any time in their history. And then finally, on capturing territory, I already said that. He has not even captured what he annexed on paper, that is the 4 regions of eastern Ukraine. He still is not in control of that territory. And fifth, on NATO expansion, he's achieved exactly the opposite, right? Finland is about to join, Sweden hopefully will join. So he failed on all of his objectives in 2022. That's the good news. The bad news is that 2023 has been a slogfest where nobody is achieving anything except killing each other. Bakhmut in particular has just been horrific if you look at the numbers there. And what Putin is gambling on, he thinks that time is on his side. He thinks he doesn't have to answer to anybody back home. Remember, it's a dictatorship, neither from the right nor the democratic opposition. He doesn't need to save face in front of anybody. So he thinks if he can just gut it out, stick it out, he'll have the resources to eventually try to take all of Donbass, all of those 4 territories that he annexed on paper. And I think that's his goal for 2023 or 2024. And he thinks that time's on his side because he thinks we're going to lose interest. We're going to lose patience. And he watches, maybe he doesn't personally, but he has people on his staff who does. He watches the debate here at home. He hears what Tucker Carlson's saying about Zelensky as a despot. That's what he said recently. And critics saying we should pull out. And so he thinks time is on his side. Therefore, to answer your question, I think we have to do more faster now. More and better weapons now. ATACMS in particular, the long-range artillery systems that President Zelensky and his military advisors have been asking for a long time. Fighter jets, we've seen some progress on that with the Poles recently announcing that they're going to send MiG-29s. The sooner the better we can do that. In other words, this is I think, the pivotal year on the battlefield. And so rather than incrementalism, incremental support, I think we in the United States and the NATO alliance should be all in to help Ukrainians achieve the counteroffensive victory that they are planning for this summer. And then second, I would add to that, more on sanctions, more sanctions and better sanctions to reduce Putin's capabilities to continue to fight his war in Ukraine.
Thank you for that great answer. Third question is, I wonder if you could talk about, there have been statements in Congress. Speaker McCarthy said that Ukraine shouldn't get a blank check. Governor DeSantis in Florida referred to the war, the invasion, as a quote unquote territorial dispute. He said it's not in vital national security interest. What is the impact of these kind of statements and the fact that Russians use these as echo influence? And do you think that represents a sharp change in opinion by American people, or could?
Well, let me tell you my views and let me speculate about American views, which I'm not as much of an expert on. First, with respect to Governor DeSantis, I just disagree with him. I think he's wrong about that. American vital national security interests are at stake here for several reasons. One, remember, we fought World War II because we wanted to stop wars of annexation, wars of imperialism, and crimes against humanity. We set up the United Nations to prevent these things from happening in the future. And for several decades, at least in Europe, they weren't happening. If we go back to a world where the powerful can just invade their neighbors and annex territory and slaughter civilians the way that Mr. Putin is doing now, rightfully indicted by the International Criminal Court, in my view, that's a Hobbesian anarchic world that will eventually affect us directly. Because if Putin wins in Ukraine, you know who's going to be threatened next? Our NATO allies on the borders. And you know what they'll demand from us more? More spending, more military assistance, and more American soldiers in Europe. So this idea that we can just pretend this is a territorial dispute far away, you know, I'm writing this book about lessons from the Cold War, lessons from World War I and World War II. This reminds me exactly what some Americans said during the 30s. You know, where is Poland? It's not our battle. Why do we care? We know how that ended. Let's learn those lessons and not repeat those mistakes from the past. But secondly, what happens in Europe affects America's reputation and around the world. If Putin, God forbid, wins in Ukraine, that will embolden Xi Jinping to use military force against Taiwan. That will cause the rest of the world, that, you know, there are lots of countries in the world that are kind of sitting on the sidelines right now saying this is not our war. If Putin wins, they're going to lean a little bit more towards Putin and Xi. And if we win, they're going to lean a little bit more towards us. Therefore, I just think with respect, you know, there are many people in the Republican Party that says our real interests are in Asia. I think they're intertwined. And I think if you lose in Europe, that creates a victory for the autocrats that will embolden Xi Jinping. And conversely, if the Ukrainians win with our assistance, that will, I think, cause Mr. Xi Jinping to think a little harder about invading Taiwan. I was just in Taiwan several months ago, and I can tell you there's no government in the world, no group of people in the world cheering harder for the Ukrainians to win than the Taiwanese, because they see these things intertwined. Second, with respect to your other question about Speaker McCarthy, I agree with Speaker McCarthy that Ukraine shouldn't get a blank check. You know who else agrees with him? President Zelensky. The Ukrainians aren't asking for a blank check. They are watching every penny of assistance that comes into their country. Again, you're going to have Ambassador Power on later. You should ask her about American economic and humanitarian assistance, which has been tremendous in my view. USAID does not get enough attention in terms of the heroic work they're doing inside the country. But they're watching that money very closely. And you know what? Ukraine is also a democracy with an incredibly vibrant civil society, with watchdog organizations and civil society organizations that are watching and investigating what the government is doing, what our governments are doing from the outside. They have a independent media that is also watching these things. And that's why from time to time, you hear about corruption scandals inside Ukraine and people get dismissed. That to me is a good sign, not a bad sign. You don't hear about that in Russia, by the way, right? You don't hear about corruption, people getting dismissed, because nobody's watching Mr. Putin inside his autocracy. That to me are good signals. We don't want a blank check. We want accountability. We want transparency. And I think what the system in place, including the non-governmental dimensions of it, are working rather effectively inside Ukraine right now.
Great, thank you. And thank you especially for highlighting that contradiction between, for Republicans in particular, who say they're focused on the threat from China, ignore Russia, and don't understand the direct connection between the two. Putin has been using this term about denazification of Ukraine. You mentioned it before. And this is so offensive for many reasons, not the least of which, of course, as you also pointed out, is that President Zelensky is Jewish. What, in your view, is the danger of this narrative? And is it effective in Russia, for example, among the Russian people?
It's a great question, Tom. And I don't have a great answer. I have a speculative answer about inside Russia. And that reminds me, I should have added to the list of what more we should be doing, the United States and the free world. We need to be figuring out more effective ways to communicate directly with Russians. I would say that about Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East is more generally. You know, when I was ambassador, I put a lot of effort into public diplomacy. That's when I got on Twitter because my boss, Secretary Clinton, told me to. That's when I did lots of public speaking until Putin eventually banned me from speaking at universities. And that dimension of our policy, I think, needs a lot more attention. Just a lot more attention. We're just not doing enough. We got to think more creatively about that, because I think Putin is winning the information war inside his country. I watch a lot of Russian TV, so you don't have to. And let me tell you, if you watch Russian television today, you wouldn't even know that they're fighting Ukrainians. The way it's framed is they're fighting NATO and the United States in Ukraine with their Nazi proxies, right? And that's a way to dehumanize Ukrainians, right? If you call them Nazis, then that invokes the one great metaphor that Russians are proud of. That's the Great Patriotic War, right? We call it World War II. And so for that, that's the way he's framing this. This is just a replay of World War II, right? The threat from the West. Coming from the West towards Russia. And we have got to take on that narrative, because you see in the opinion polls that is increasing the way that Russians are thinking of this war inside Ukraine. The threat from Ukraine to Putin is democracy and freedom. It's not NATO expansion. That's what threatens him the most. And that's why he needs to undermine the functioning of democracy. And one of his tools in his arsenal is to say that they're all run by Nazis, supported by us. And I just think we've got to do a much more effective job of taking on that narrative.
Also, I wonder if you could speak about events as we sort of look forward. And of course, predicting is always it's always difficult. It's easier to look back and forward. But how do you see the events transpire over the next few years? You talked about sort of, the Russians having a lot of patience and Putin waiting us out. And how do you see an end game? How do you see this all resolving itself?
Tom, you're asking a lot of hard questions. That may be the hardest of all. I don't have an answer to your question, and I don't believe anybody who proclaims they have an answer to that question. We political scientists, we're not great at predicting the ends of wars. We're not great at predicting revolutions, democratization. By the way, and I see Ambassador Powers joined us. I worked in the government for 5 years, and I would say CIA is not so great at predicting those events either. But what I would say as a stab at your question, tragically, I don't see yet any sign that Vladimir Putin is going to stop fighting, is going to stop his occupation of Ukraine until he gets to those borders that I described earlier. I just have not seen one word that he said yet that suggests he's interested in compromise. And therefore, when I talk to Ukrainian officials, which I do rather frequently, their position is we have no choice. It's not that they want to keep fighting, but they see no choice but to try to push him out of those territories. And until they can do that, they don't see that there'll be conditions for any kind of settlement. And so I don't see this ending anytime soon because of those two conditions, Mr. Putin's condition and Mr. President Zelensky's conditions.
Well, if anybody could answer these tough questions, Mr. Ambassador, you are it, and you've knocked it out of the park every single time. It's really been a privilege to have you. We thank you so very, very much. You're welcome to stay on with Ambassador Powers as well. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you again, and best of luck to you. And I highly recommend your book, by the way. The most recent.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Handing over the baton to Ambassador Power.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador McFaul, and to Tom for being with us today. I'm now delighted to introduce our second guest this afternoon, my former boss when she was serving as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, USAID Administrator Samantha Power. From her work out of government, at first as a journalist and as a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and as a Harvard professor, and now in government, first on the Obama National Security Council at the UN, and now as head of USAID, the world's leading international development agency and a critical arm of the US government, Administrator Power has devoted her career to defending global democracy, providing humanitarian assistance, preventing genocide, and protecting the vulnerable. Administrator Power was the first senior U.S. official to visit Ukraine after the Russian invasion, and she has been tireless in her efforts to provide support to the Ukrainian people. Under her leadership, USAID has provided over $13 billion in humanitarian aid to Ukraine, including support for the energy grid, agricultural sector, healthcare, education, and emergency response efforts. Administrator Power, we're honored to have you join us today, and I'm particularly honored for two reasons. First, you are someone from whom I have learned so much. And second, because your efforts, including at USAID, are defending the values that matter the most to this organization, JDCA. So to start today, could you please give us an overview, especially for those who may not know about AID, about the role that you are playing in Ukraine and have played since the start of this war?
Thank you so much, Haley, and great to see my former colleague, Mike McFaul. And I hope and assume he said nothing critical about the Biden administration in his comments, but I wasn't able to catch the beginning. So forgive if some of what I say seems a little bit out of context. But in this answer, Haley, maybe our guests can indulge me for a little bit, because there is so much that USAID is doing right now in Ukraine that I think the broad majority of people, even who are following Ukraine, are, unaware of. And so just to give you a flavor of this, of course, there's acute humanitarian need and has been from February 24th last year, the mass displacement that occurred. A lot of focus on the number of Ukrainians who flowed into Europe. I myself was at the border a few days after the conflict started, and these harrowing scenes of mothers with their children, the men, being left behind or staying behind in order to be part of the fight. And of course, the welcome, by and large, that those refugees have received across Europe and here in the United States, which is a good thing. But also, is an expensive proposition that almost inevitably affects humanitarian assistance budgets, development budgets for our colleagues in Europe, for our counterparts, basically. And so you now see a lot of pressure on aid budgets across the board. Not only because, but in part because of the toll of Ukrainians coming across and because of the generosity of that welcome. USAID's work is mainly inside Ukraine. So if people are displaced or if they've suffered, for example, sexual violence, which has been a tactic of war by the Russian forces in places that they've occupied or where they've been able to take over territory, even if temporarily in some cases, that psychosocial support, temporary housing for those whose houses have been destroyed. So that's under the humanitarian umbrella. And I think, Haley, in your introduction, you were describing the vast sums of resources that we've expended in Ukraine, but only a very small share, actually under 10% of what the taxpayer has empowered us to do is in that acute humanitarian phase, notwithstanding the acute humanitarian needs. I think we're meeting them with our partners. But the vast majority of what we're doing is what we call kind of the other front in the war. And that is keeping the government's lights on. They have a huge budget deficit, $5 billion a month, roughly. And USAID is providing, this is very unusual for us, but thanks to Congress, providing direct budget support so that the Ukrainian government itself can actually pay firefighters and first responders, pay health workers, pay teachers, make sure that pensioners still have a means of living, even if they haven't been displaced. They still need some way of getting access to some kind of check each month, as would happen in this country too if we were in this situation. So direct budget support is a very, very significant component of USAID's work. Wonderfully, the European Union actually at the tail end of last year, after some kind of halting infusions, where some months it was on, some months it was off, now itself has actually matched us as well for this calendar year in providing roughly $1.5 billion a month in order to deal with those kind of basic expenses. Because again, imagine the scenario if you're providing state-of-the-art weapon systems and Leopard tanks and the like, and yet your fire brigades are no longer functioning, or your government ministry doesn't have enough money to keep a generator powered, or worse, a surgeon who's carrying out surgery doesn't have that backup generator for when Russia strikes. Well, that generator costs money, that fuel costs money. So that's a piece of it. The other thing is, and I'm going on because I think a lot of this work Americans find, very, very interesting. And again, it's not that well known, is on the energy sector. Putin made a strategic choice heading into the winter that he was going to systematically target critical infrastructure and try to take the heat out, try to take the lights out, basically to weaponize winter. And we, at a strategic level as an administration, came together and decided, okay, well, we're going to try to stop him and prevent him from weaponizing winter. And it's too soon to declare that mission successful, but certainly the programming has been effective. And that is everything, Haley, from providing, thousands of generators. I think we're close to 3,000 generators we've provided now, auto transformers, mobile substations, mobile power stations, which are, kind of generators on steroids that can power. In one instance, one delivery was, I think, 100,000 households were going to get powered by a USAID delivery of this nature. The steel pipes, when those pipes get destroyed, us going and working with our friends internationally to procure, I think we're at 70 kilometers worth of steel pipes to replace those that Putin's forces are taking out. So I think the energy sector is an important area to highlight. And then there's much else to say, but the last area I would highlight, and anybody who wants to ask a question on any other domain, happy to take it, but is actually when you hear about direct budget support and about Ukraine's the track record when it comes to corruption and how challenging that has been, you might say, oh my gosh, direct budget support to the government. But we have kept right along supporting the independent institutions in the Ukrainian system, everything from the special prosecutor for corruption, which include corruption crimes, as well as now taking on in the Prosecutor General's office, taking on war crimes prosecutions as well, which USAID also supports the documentation of war crimes. But the civil society organizations, the major ones that are actually tracking not only whether there's corruption in the dispersal of aid, which of course some of that has surfaced, and that's in part because an investigative journalist who USAID had funded, this independent media organization, raised the red flag, and then these institutions within the Ukrainian government, the anti-corruption institutions, kick in and begin to impose oversight. We've just launched a new project toward the end of the year that I'm particularly enthused about, which is their Supreme Audit Institution, USAID partnering with GAO to actually strengthen, during the war, the auditing capabilities of Ukrainian institutions. And then while there are USAID programs in trying to deepen judicial integrity, vet judges, have asset disclosures and things like that online for the parliament, as well as for people who work within the executive. Again, it's not enough to rely on those internal institutional developments and reforms that USAID has been supporting. We've been active in Ukraine since 1992, but really supporting in earnest since the Maidan revolution. But it's, again, the outsiders, the civil society groups, the media, and others who will be crying foul if some of those institutions, lapse or fall down on the job. So I mention that because I think it's sort of amazing when you think about it. Imagine growing your democracy, strengthening your institutions, At the same time, passing through the RADA procurement reforms, asset disclosure laws, the next phase of judicial reform, doing all of that democracy building work at the same time Putin is pulverizing your cities and your communities, with missiles and atrocities for those towns, again, that have come under Russian control. And that is the importance of looking at U.S. support for this effort on both fronts. And it's one reason, again, that work on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in sustaining the constituency to support Ukraine, it's really important to sustain support on both of these fronts. Because again, to do the counterfactual, what would happen if you actually, on the home front, if the lights had gone out, if people had frozen to death over the course of a winter, if those anti-corruption institutions were not functioning or developing at the same time as the war, well, what would that mean for security assistance and the checks and balances actually even on the weapon systems, and whether, we can work to strengthen systems even alongside getting the weapons to the front line, which is what other agencies or U.S. government agencies are working to do. So that's a taste of it. It adds up, as you said. It's, I think, more than $15 billion now in overall assistance, but it runs the gamut. And even our, programs on getting COVID vaccine shots into arms, enhancing surgical care, making sure that every hospital, again, has a generator, a backup generator for, every sector of the Ukrainian economy. USAID had worked in before this latest round of the war commenced on February 24th. And now, thanks to these supplemental bills that have passed through Congress, we've actually been able to increase our work in these institutional domains or in these very specific economic sectors. And it's been, it's going to put Ukraine, if Ukraine gets through the war, and when it gets through the war, and when it emerges, it's going to be much more integrated into Europe and have much more resilience built in as a design feature to its everything from its cybersecurity to its energy to its agriculture, ironically, than it did before Putin invaded in the first place. But getting through the war, of course, is the challenge on hand right now, as Mike was speaking to.
Well, thanks to you and everyone at USAID for this remarkably important effort that is ongoing. Something that so many, including myself, deeply admire about you, Administrator Power, is your commitment to engaging with, educating, and imparting knowledge and humanitarian values on the next generation of leaders. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn this over now to a few younger members of the JDCA community to ask you a few questions. So our first question will be asked by JDCA's Outreach and Program Manager, Alan Schulman, a recent graduate of Michigan State University and a first-generation American whose family immigrated from the Soviet Union. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you so much, Haley. It is such an honor to be on the JDCA team with you. Administrator Power, I just want to start by expressing my profound gratitude to you for everything you and USAID have done for the Ukrainian people in the face of this invasion by Vladimir Putin. You recently referred to the Russian invasion as a campaign of destruction. You touched on this a bit in your first answer, but could you please speak a little more about the humanitarian impact of Russia's ongoing attacks in Ukraine, specifically as it relates to Ukrainians who have been uprooted, displaced, and forced to flee as refugees, like my family did from the Soviet Union over 30 years ago?
Thank you so much. Well, let me start by just talking briefly about something I touched upon just at the end of my previous response, which is the mass atrocities, right? Because sometimes when we talk about humanitarian impact, we can think of it only as, maybe just not that this isn't only, but as displacement or as, as food needs or and so forth, all of which I'll come back to. But I do think that, part of the strategy, as you note in your question, this sort of campaign of destruction, does really, at least what the forces are doing out in the field, Russian forces are doing when they are in positions to occupy, and whether that's Kadyrov's forces or Wagner forces or conventional Russian forces, is you're seeing executions of civilians, executions of prisoners of war, prisoners who've been taken, have their hands tied, some of the mass graves that have been unearthed, as territory has come back into Ukrainian hands. And, it's tempting to see Putin at his long table, there in Russia, and think somehow that this impunity that he feels right now is a permanent condition. There's of course accountability through sanctions and other things, but fundamentally accountability for any war crimes committed is fundamental. And so because the toll of this war is being felt not only on the battlefield by brave Ukrainian soldiers who are putting their lives on the line, and that is itself, again, because this is a war of choice by Putin, a terrible, terrible human toll, but also, again, these attacks on civilians. So these crimes carried out in occupation, the brutality of attacks on maternity wards, and civilian infrastructure, all of that has to be documented now, because the truth is we don't have any way of predicting exactly not only how this would end precisely in the way that Ambassador McFaul was speaking to, but also if you look at any of the areas where you have seen actually courtroom accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity, in I think none of those circumstances at the height of the war would you have guessed that the perpetrators of atrocity would end up being held accountable. And I say this as somebody who started my career, as Haley alluded to, in the former Yugoslavia, where these guys, Milosevic and Karadzic and Mladic, the political leadership, the generals, strutting around, feeling as if they would never be held to account, just feeling such impunity. But that record was established, the documentation was done, and then eventually all three of them found themselves in the Hague. And so right now, USAID, as I alluded to, is supporting the documentation of war crimes. We've, I think at this point, documented, the organizations we partner with have documented more than 30,000 alleged war crimes, working, of course, with Attorney General Garland and the Department of Justice as well. But, those institutions, again, are being, the airplane is being, in this case, not so much built as it is being flown, but amended, because we had invested actually in the documentation of atrocities in Crimea and in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine before Putin carried out the full-scale invasion starting in February of last year. So we had a program that was already underway, but the scale of atrocities causing this dire humanitarian impact, of course, has expanded dramatically. In terms of the more traditional understanding of humanitarian impact, which might have been what you meant, again, I've said, I think, very, very impressive response by European nations to the influx. Ukrainian kids now welcomed into schools, whether in Poland, in Germany. I've been a couple times to Moldova since the conflict started. That they actually, a very small country itself, partially occupied by Russian forces, very vulnerable to Russian energy blackmail, and yet actually had more Ukrainians passing through per capita than any other country in Europe. It's important to sustain that. At the same time, what you are seeing as well is a desire for Ukrainians to go home to those areas that have not, that are not on the front lines, or that are sufficiently removed from the front lines that parents feel they can safely bring their kids back. Because that's mainly what you saw coming into Europe are families. But again, really credit the national governments and the publics in those European nations that have extended the welcome mat, giving full access to social services, including schooling. And then lastly, inside Ukraine, I think we have large international organizations that we are working through, but that's like World Food Program, for example, that's a key partner for us. And they are reaching millions of Ukrainians each month, mainly actually with cash assistance, because as is true in many parts of the world now, not only do the recipients prefer cash because they actually, it's in accordance with their freedom of choice, with their dignity, how they would wish to spend cash, how they would wish to allocate that rather than getting some sack of wheat or something. In Ukraine, cash is proving the best way for food, shelter, and other purposes. But it also gets the Ukrainian economy geared up in a way that we really needed to. And one of the advantages of Ukrainians coming home and resuming work in Ukraine is that is also increasing the tax base. So what I didn't mention in my opening statement is USAID is also supporting Ukrainian farmers with low interest loans, with new equipment to replace any equipment that Putin's forces have destroyed. And we have a whole new initiative supporting SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, because getting the economy going, getting people back to work, we have to guard against scenarios where this war drags on, and we guard against that by other agencies, of course, providing the necessary security assistance to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for any negotiation. But we also guard against it by building in more resilience into the economy and trying to get sectors that can still be very productive, like the agricultural sector and like actually the tech sector, to ensure that those economic sectors continue to deliver, continue to be a source of employment, but also a source of tax revenue for the government, so that these large infusions of direct budget support hopefully over time can be tapered or reduced somewhat, or those resources can be channeled into other domains.
Great, thank you, Alan. Our next question will come from our outreach intern, Becca Hammerman, a graduate student in public administration at GW. Becca.
Thank you so much, Haley, and thank you, Administrator Power. When you traveled to Ukraine in October, you visited a school that had been damaged by Russian missiles. What has been the impact of the war on women, children, and students who represent the next generation in Ukraine?
Thank you. First of all, one thing I will say about the COVID-19 sort of legacy is that Ukrainian students, like so many students globally, had become accustomed to learning online. And indeed, many schools, I was sort of surprised by this myself, but many schools in Ukraine had not gone back to in-person learning when Putin launched the full-scale invasion in February. And this is yet another reason why keeping the lights on, keeping the power going through the winter was so important. It may well be another factor behind Putin's desire to take the lights out and to take electricity out. Because of course, the more, if you're a parent and your kid is not able to get access to electricity and schooling that way, then the more likely they are to go further afield into Europe. I think in Putin's logic, the more people go into Europe, eventually European patience wears thin in his account, although he's been proven wrong in all of his predictions. But he's counting on creating difficulties for an alliance that has shown remarkable unity and endurance already in this now 13-month almost conflict, or phase of the conflict, I should say, since there was a conflict that predated 2022. But so this online learning has been a godsend, as has the heroism of Ukrainian teachers, who almost no matter their circumstances, in some cases from the bottom of subway stations or bomb shelters, which are basically, you mentioned the school that I visited, what had been a school classroom but was lower down was turned into a de facto bomb shelter for the neighborhood. And so parts of schools are actually being occupied as emergency shelters if they can accommodate people in that way. But from apartment basements, former, what will be future school basements, again, teachers on their laptops. We all admired so much teachers in the United States who continued teaching online and found a way to do it in creative ways when our kids here were dealing with the pandemic. Imagine as a parent what it means to you, the lifeline that Ukrainian teachers and the spiritual lifeline that Ukrainian teachers are offering to young people. So that's one aspect of it. I think, again, that's not maybe broadly understood, is that most of the young people are continuing to learn online. Many Ukrainians who are in neighboring countries have actually chosen to maintain their relationships with their previous teachers and schools, while some, again, have invested themselves in learning new languages and being part of the school system in the countries in which they now find themselves. I think that the other thing that I would, I guess, point to is, I mentioned the crisis that has been inflicted by Russian forces on women who have found themselves at Russian occupied territory. We do a lot in that kind of psychosocial care, actually working with the First Lady of Ukraine, who has made mental health and the trauma of conflict, including sexual violence, a priority of hers. And so that has been searing to see the scale of atrocity, but very specifically the use of rape as a weapon of war, including circumstances where young women, have been kept in captivity by Russian soldiers, over a protracted period of time, and just devastating circumstances, which, again, it'll be generations for any semblance of recovery. Finally, I would just add, because you mentioned education and schooling, the importance of the private sector. One of the things we try to do at USAID is, find partners who are eager to contribute at times like this. Sometimes there's an impulse among citizens, to want to give things. Things are actually hard to work with if you're USAID, because sometimes transporting them, let's say, from the United States over to Ukraine costs more than it might have to procure locally. And we want to get the Ukrainian economy, again, as close to approximating its pre-war self as possible. And so cash is actually better generally. But that said, when Microsoft comes along and is willing to offer laptops to Ukrainian school-aged children, again, to continue this kind of learning, or private sector partners in other European countries do the same, that makes a world of difference. And so we have really interesting partnerships that we've done, with Visa in terms of the use of tech to deliver social services to Ukrainians. Microsoft, again, when it comes to tech education or using IT to make sure that there aren't huge gaps in learning, and just encourage anybody who's plugged in with the private sector, if they want to talk to USAID about what a private sector partnership could look like. That's an absolutely critical part of the solution now as well.
Great. Thank you, Becca. Our final question will come from JDCA Programming and Public Engagement Fellow, David Nafulin, who is in his second year at GW Law School. David.
Great. Thank you very much, Haley. And thank you, Administrator Power, for all of your vital work and for taking the time to speak with us today. I wanted to ask you about the importance of journalism in a time like this. Of course, high quality journalism is never more important than during wartime. And as many people on this call may know, as just one example, there are publications such as the Kyiv Independent, for example, which is providing really vital insights into the day-to-day realities of the situation, and in particular, how this war is taking a toll on ordinary civilians. And I wanted to ask you if you could speak with us about the role that USAID has played in supporting journalists in Ukraine, and how these efforts have helped to shape public opinion, both in the US and around the world.
That's great. Thank you for the question, and fully embrace the presence about the importance of this work. In so many respects. I gave an example earlier about a journalist who raised an initial flag that then led the sort of system, the system crackdown on corruption that made headlines a month or two ago. That's, I think, one example of the work in training independent media that USAID has been a part of, and the US government as a whole has been a part of. But what would get less attention, perhaps, is some of the reforms, the legislative reforms and the regulatory reforms that have made it easier for independent journalists to operate. Now, needless to say, as a country liberalizes, as Ukraine had been doing, posing, of course, a great threat to Putin in all respects. But you would expect, again, a more permissive environment for journalists to operate on. But actually, laws granting the public access to more information, sort of right to information, to allow journalists on the outside to be able to access information that had been obscured, and still where there'll be recalcitrant individuals who don't want to post their assets online or don't want to respond to requests from outside. I think that's an example as well of the kind of, you might call it enabling environment work. So that enabling environment work with legislators, with civil society organizations that aren't just holding government to account, but are actually proposing constructively what are the systemic changes that would be needed in order for journalists in the long term to be performing that work. I think that's been really important. USAID was a major funder and influencer, I think it's fair to say, in the effort by Ukrainians as well to create an effective public broadcasting institution. We all know in the United States how invaluable our public broadcasting has been, and helping establish its public service broadcaster, I think, has been incredibly important. We have, I think, in total supported since 2018, 53 local media support organizations, you might call them, and more than 700 independent media outlets through grants, training, and technical assistance. And again, our goal is not to influence content in any way, but to work with journalists who may be pivoting into that career for the first time, or may have been in the past, or maybe, for example, now reporting on an active frontline situation, on an active battlefront for the first time, even to make sure that they have flak jackets and helmets. We've done a huge amount of provision of those kinds of resources in light of the fact that many journalists have had to repurpose or redirect their journalistic energy on war-related investigations or war-related news information. The very last thing I would say maybe is on disinformation, which I don't know if that came up with Ambassador McFaul, but of course is a major feature of the battlefront as well in its own way. And you could imagine how powerful disinformation can be. We know Russia's capabilities in this domain. We live them, some of us, every day on our Twitter feeds, the Russian trolls and the campaigns, the disinformation campaigns that have even, of course, had a hand in our own democracy, not just as Twitter trolls, but in more strategic ways in recent years. We, USAID, invested in a center basically to combat disinformation, which is hybrid civil society and governmental. And I think they've been very good at naming the memes and documenting spikes in disinformation in particular domains, which can be a form of inoculation, this idea of almost pre-budding. And Lord knows, again, the Russian Federation is investing vast resources in trying to win the war of information. But in addition to naming the bad and the lying, again, just to remember always that the flow of independent sources of news and making sure that those media outlets also know how to go digital, that they know how to be viable. We have a media viability accelerator initiative at USAID that isn't just Ukraine focused, but is on helping independent media outlets figure out how to operate in this really complicated business environment that even local independent media in the US has struggled to transition through. So we try to think of this media journalistic sector as an ecosystem where, wouldn't be enough just to train journalists or to give them flak jackets, no more than it would be enough to have, great laws that were very permissive and that posted politicians' assets online if you didn't have the journalists themselves. No more than all of that would be effective if a disinformation onslaught weakened morale and undermined public support and solidarity. Again, as one component of the Russian Federation's war approach. So thinking systemically, I think, is something that the Ukrainians have been remarkable at doing, and for us to fall in line and to find ways to strategically support these different ways of getting at the same challenge, which is the right to information and the right of free expression and freedom of the press. Ultimately, that's a real privilege, actually, as a former journalist, to be at USAID and to be able to be supportive of these incredibly brave people on the line who are thinking 5 steps ahead. Not only what's the story of today, but structurally, what do we need to do as a society? And again, back to the point I made in my opening, that is going to make Ukraine just an incredibly vibrant and much more resilient democracy when this conflict is over. And remember, so many Ukrainians are thinking not just about winning this war, but getting into the European Union and being a model democracy. They recognize they have a long way to go, but I love this way that they think in terms of the system and not just in terms of, freedom to write what you want in the moment, but what are the checks and balances more broadly, and what are the sort of prophylactic steps you can take to make sure that you build a system that ultimately can withstand the kinds of disinformation shocks, but also, any changes in leadership, or changes in political will, that those systems are strong enough to endure, people who might be less intent, again, on growing this sector. So.
Great. Well, thank you, David. And thanks to all of our younger JDCA community members for their questions. I want to thank Ambassador McFaul and Administrator Power for joining us today, for sharing so much information with us. And thanks to the hundreds of you for your participation and your interest. JDCA is proud to stand with the Ukrainian people and will continue to support the Biden administration's efforts to provide Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance, including that provided by USAID. To learn more about JDCA and how you can join additional programs like this, or if you're interested in becoming a member, please visit jewishdem's.org. And as we close today's program, we want to thank all of you again, including our speakers, for spending your time with us today. And we look forward to seeing you again. And a special thanks to Administrator Power. I know how busy your day is, and we're so grateful you spent some of it with us. Thank you.